The maintenance bay of Nexus Station hummed with the constant vibration of quantum engines cycling through their startup sequence. Marcus Chun wiped grease from his hands with a stained rag, his brown eyes scanning the massive fusion drive assembly that hung suspended above the repair pit. Steam hissed from cooling pipes, and the sharp smell of ozone mixed with lubricant oil filled the recycled air. Another day, another broken hyperdrive. Marcus muttered to himself, though he knew he wasn't really alone. The feeling had been with him for months now, ever since he'd taken the job as chief mechanic on this backwater space station. It was like having helpful shadows that moved just outside his vision, anticipating his needs before he even knew them himself. The station served as a refueling stop for ships traveling between the outer colonies and the core worlds. Most of the crew were non-human species, tall, blue-skinned Valens with their perfectly logical minds, the crystalline Zephyrite who communicated through harmonic vibrations, and the insect-like Thraxans with their compound eyes and chittering language. As the only human on the technical crew, Marcus had learned to keep his head down and do his job well. The cargo bay doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss, and Marcus looked up to see 3 young aliens entering his workspace. The leader was a Valen girl named ZYX, 441, her azure skin marked with the geometric tattoos that indicated her family's engineering lineage. Behind her followed Chirp, a small Zephyrite whose crystalline body rang like wind chimes when he moved, and bringing up the rear was Skitter, a young Thraxan whose mandibles clicked nervously as she took in the cluttered workshop. Human Marcus, ZYX, 441 said in the formal tone her people always used. We require your assistance with an academic project. Marcus set down his plasma wrench and turned to face them fully. These 3 were part of the station's youth education program, kids of crew members who were learning about different ship systems. They occasionally visited his workshop as part of their technical studies, though they usually kept their distance. Humans had a reputation throughout the galaxy. They were known for being unpredictable, emotional, and prone to believing in things that couldn't be scientifically proven. What kind of project? Marcus asked, gesturing for them to come closer to his workbench. Chirp's body chimed softly as he communicated through harmonic frequencies. ZYX, 441 nodded and translated. Chirp says we're studying the mythology and folklore of different species. We must present examples of how primitive belief systems develop in pre-spaceflight civilizations. And you want to know about human myths? Marcus said, understanding where this was heading. Precisely. Skitter stepped forward, her multiple eyes focusing independently on different parts of the workshop. We have already cataloged Valen mathematical mysticism and Thraxan ancestor tunnels. Human folklore appears to be particularly creative. Marcus couldn't help but smile. He'd heard that tone before, the polite way aliens described human imagination when they thought it was completely ridiculous. What specifically are you looking for? ZYX, 441 consulted a datapad. Our research indicates humans believe in creatures called elves, small humanoid beings that allegedly assist with manual labor while remaining hidden. This appears to be a psychological mechanism for explaining efficiency improvements that early humans could not understand scientifically. Elves aren't real, Skitter added with the confidence that only came from youth and absolute certainty. Obviously, but we need to understand why humans created such myths. Marcus felt something shift in the air around him, a subtle change in temperature and pressure that made the hair on his arms stand up. He'd experienced this sensation many times before, usually right before something helpful happened in his workshop. Tools would appear exactly where he needed them, or solutions to complex problems would suddenly become clear. He'd always attributed it to his own unconscious processes, his trained intuition as a skilled mechanic. Well, Marcus said slowly, elves in human folklore weren't exactly what you might think. They weren't always small, and they didn't just do manual labor. But there were stories about helpful spirits who would assist craftsmen and workers. Primitive superstition, ZYX 441 said dismissively. no doubt based on misunderstood observations of natural phenomena. As if in response to her words, Marcus's plasma wrench, which he had definitely placed on the left side of his workbench, was now sitting on the right side, exactly where he would need it to continue working on the fusion drive assembly. None of the young aliens seemed to notice the movement. Maybe, Marcus said carefully, or maybe there are things in the universe that we don't fully understand yet. Chirp chimed in what sounded like amusement, and ZYX441 translated. He says that statement is scientifically meaningless. If something exists and affects the physical world, it can be measured and categorized. If it cannot be measured, it does not exist in any meaningful sense. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. That's good scientific thinking. But sometimes the instruments we use to measure things aren't sophisticated enough to detect everything that's there. He moved toward the fusion drive assembly, ostensibly to continue his work, but really to see if anything else would happen. As he reached for a diagnostic scanner, it was already in his hand, though he was certain he'd left it in the equipment locker across the room. For example, Marcus continued, holding up the scanner, this device can measure quantum flux variations down to the femtometer level. But it can't measure friendship, or the feeling you get when you solve a difficult problem, or the satisfaction of helping someone. Those are biochemical processes, Skitter interjected. Neurochemical reactions that serve evolutionary purposes. They can be measured through brain scans and hormone levels. Can they? Marcus asked. Can you measure the exact neurochemical formula for the feeling a parent has when their child takes their first steps? Can you quantify the precise moment when someone decides to risk their life to save a stranger? The three young aliens exchanged looks. This wasn't the kind of conversation they'd expected to have about primitive human superstitions. Marcus began running his scanner over the fusion drive components, and as he worked, he started to notice more small anomalies. His tools were always exactly where he needed them. Readings on his diagnostic equipment seemed to clear up and stabilize just as he was looking at them. When he reached for a calibration device that should have been in storage, it was already sitting on the workbench beside him. The point is, Marcus said as he worked, just because we can't see something or measure it with current technology doesn't mean it isn't there. Human history is full of things that seemed like magic until we understood them better. Lightning, radiation, quantum mechanics. All of them seemed supernatural until we developed the tools to study them properly. ZYX441 frowned, her facial tattoos shifting with her expression. You're suggesting that these elves might actually exist? I'm suggesting that the universe is bigger and more complex than any of us fully understand, Marcus replied. Human folklore might be primitive in some ways, but it's also been around for thousands of years. Maybe some of those stories persist because they're based on real experiences that people just didn't have a language to describe scientifically. As if to emphasize his point, a gentle breeze seemed to flow through the workshop, carrying with it the faint scent of pine trees and morning dew, completely impossible in the recycled atmosphere of a space station. The three young aliens didn't seem to notice, but Marcus felt the familiar presence growing stronger around him. Chirp chimed a complex melody, and ZYX441 translated. He says you are engaging in what humans call wishful thinking. The desire to believe in something does not make it real. True, Marcus agreed. But the desire to disbelieve in something doesn't make it false, either. He continued working on the fusion drive, and the subtle assistance continued. Components that should have been difficult to reach seemed to position themselves perfectly for access. Error codes on his displays cleared themselves just as he was about to address them. The work that should have taken him the rest of the day was progressing with remarkable efficiency. Skitter's compound eyes tracked his movements with increasing interest. Human Marcus, your repair work is proceeding at a rate significantly above standard efficiency metrics. I've been doing this for a long time, Marcus said. Experience makes a difference. But, according to station records, ZYX441 consulted her data pad. Your efficiency ratings have improved by 37% since you began working here 6 months ago. That level of improvement is statistically improbable for someone of your experience level. Marcus paused in his work. He'd never really thought about it in those terms, but now that she mentioned it, he had been getting a lot more done lately. Jobs that used to take days were finishing in hours. Complex problems seemed to solve themselves just as he was starting to work on them. "Maybe I'm just hitting my stride," he said. "Sometimes when you're in the right environment, everything clicks." But even as he said it, Marcus was starting to wonder. The helpful presence he'd been feeling, the tools that appeared exactly when he needed them, the solutions that came to him just at the right moment. What if there was more to it than just his own skill and intuition? The fusion drive assembly hummed to life as Marcus completed another circuit repair. The sound was clean and steady, without the harmonics that had been plaguing the system for weeks. He ran a full diagnostic, and every reading came back in the optimal range. "Impressive," ZYX441 admitted. "That repair should have required at least 2 additional technicians and a complete system shutdown. Not bad for primitive human superstition," Marcus said with a grin. Chirp chimed what sounded like a question, and ZYX441 translated. "He wants to know if you truly believe these helper spirits exist, or if you're simply using the concept as a metaphor for optimized workflow efficiency." Marcus considered the question seriously. The rational part of his mind, the part that had been trained in engineering and physics, said that everything that had been happening could be explained by his own subconscious competence and pattern recognition. The part of him that had grown up listening to his grandmother's stories about the old country, where people left out small offerings for the household spirits who helped with daily chores, wasn't so sure. "I think," Marcus said slowly, "that there are helpful forces in the universe. Maybe there's psychological, maybe there's something else entirely. But I know that when I treat my work with respect, when I'm grateful for the tools and skills I have, things go better." "That could simply be confirmation bias," Skitter pointed out. "You notice the times when things go well and forget the times when they don't." "Could be," Marcus agreed. "But there's an easy way to test it." He looked around his workshop, taking in the organized chaos of spare parts, diagnostic equipment, and half-finished repair projects. Then he spoke directly to the empty air around him. "If there's anyone here who's been helping me with my work, I want you to know that I appreciate it. I've felt you around, and I'm grateful for everything you've done. If you're willing to show yourself to my young friends here, I think they might benefit from expanding their understanding of what's possible in the universe." The 3 young aliens stared at him with expressions ranging from concern to embarrassment. Clearly, they thought the human had finally snapped under the pressure of isolation. For a long moment, nothing happened. The workshop continued its usual mechanical humming, and Marcus began to wonder if he'd been imagining everything after all. Then the lights dimmed slightly, and the air shimmered with an opalescent quality like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the scent of pine and morning dew grew stronger. And in the spaces between the workbenches, in the corners where shadows gathered, shapes began to materialize. They were tall and elegant, with pointed ears and eyes that held depths of ancient wisdom. Their clothing seemed to be made of light and shadow woven together, and they moved with a grace that made even the fluid motions of the Valens look clumsy by comparison. ZYX 441's data pad clattered to the floor. Chirp's harmonic vibrations became a discordant jangling of shock. Skitter's mandibles clicked rapidly in what Marcus recognized as the Thraxan equivalent of stammering. The elves, for what else could they be, stepped fully into view. There were 5 of them, each carrying tools that looked like they were crafted from crystallized starlight. They arranged themselves around Marcus's workspace with the easy familiarity of beings who had been there all along, just unseen. The tallest of them, with silver hair that seemed to capture and reflect light that wasn't quite there, spoke in a voice like wind chimes and distant music. "We have been guardians of craft and creation since before your species learned to work metal. We have watched over smiths and builders, engineers and artists, anyone who makes things with skill and love. Your friend Marcus called to us across the void between worlds, not with magic or superstition, but with the simple gratitude of a craftsman who respects his tools and his trade. ZYX 441 tried to speak, but only managed a soft squeaking sound. Her entire worldview was crumbling around her as she stared at beings that couldn't exist according to every scientific principle she'd been taught. "You're really real," Marcus said, though he found he wasn't as surprised as he thought he'd be. "All this time, you've been helping me." The silver-haired elf nodded. "The universe is vast and strange, human. Your people understand this better than most, which is why your folklore speaks of us while others have forgotten. You know that there are mysteries beyond the reach of current science, wonders that exist in the spaces between what your instruments can measure." Another elf, this one with hair like spun copper, gestured toward the three young aliens who stood frozen in shock. "They are young yet," she said in a voice like gentle rain. "They have been taught that only the measurable is real, only the quantifiable has value. But they're also seekers of knowledge, and wisdom comes in many forms." Marcus looked at his three visitors, who were still staring at the elves with expressions of complete bewilderment. "I think," he said gently, "your understanding of the universe just got a little bigger." The silence in the workshop stretched for nearly a full minute as the three young aliens stared at the five elves who had materialized around Marcus's workspace. The only sounds were the ambient hum of the station's systems and Chirp's crystalline body vibrating with what could only be described as harmonic shock. Skitter was the first to recover her voice, though her mandibles continued clicking nervously. "This is impossible. You cannot exist. There are no energy signatures, no electromagnetic emissions, no quantum field disturbances. My compound eyes detect no thermal variance, no gravitational anomaly, no molecular displacement." The elf with copper hair smiled gently, and the expression held a warmth that seemed to fill the entire workshop. "Dear child, your instruments are powerful, but they measure only a narrow spectrum of reality. You scan for the music, but ignore the silence between the notes. You catalog the stars, but dismiss the darkness that holds them." ZYX 441's blue skin had paled to an almost white shade, and her geometric tattoos seemed to shift and pulse with her agitated emotional state. "Our science accounts for 93% of observable universal phenomena. Dark matter and dark energy explain the remaining 7%. There is no theoretical framework that permits the existence of—" She gestured helplessly at the elves. "Whatever you are supposed to be." "Perhaps," suggested the silver-haired elf leader, "your theoretical frameworks are incomplete." Marcus watched the exchange with fascination. He'd worked alongside these alien species for months, and he'd never seen them so thoroughly rattled. Their entire civilizations were built on logical principles and scientific reasoning. The Valens had achieved faster-than-light travel through mathematical precision. The Zephyrites communicated through frequencies that could be calculated and predicted. The Thraxans had colonized 17 worlds through careful analysis and systematic planning. And now they were face-to-face with something that challenged every assumption they'd made about the nature of reality. "But how?" Chirp chimed, his question translated through the universal communicator that all station personnel wore. "How do you exist without leaving measurable traces? How do you affect the physical world without generating detectable energy?" Another elf stepped forward, this one younger looking with dark hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His voice carried the cadence of someone accustomed to explaining complex concepts to students. "Your question assumes that consciousness and will require massive energy expenditure," he said. "But consider your own thought processes. When you decide to move your hand, does the decision itself generate electromagnetic radiation? When you feel affection for a friend, can that emotion be detected by scanning equipment? Those are biochemical processes," Skitter protested. "Neural activity can be measured through brain scans. Emotions correlate with hormonal changes. They have physical foundations." "Yes," the elf agreed. "But The biochemical processes are not the thought itself. They are merely the shadow that thought casts in the physical realm. You mistake the shadow for the substance. Marcus found himself nodding. It's like we can measure the effects of gravity, but we still don't really understand what gravity actually is. We know how it behaves, but not what it is. The silver-haired elf turned to Marcus with approval. Your species has always grasped this intuitively. You understand that meaning exists independently of measurement, that purpose can exist without physical manifestation, that help and guidance can come from sources that operate outside the boundaries of conventional matter and energy. ZYX 441 had retrieved her datapad and was frantically scanning the elves with every sensor available to her. The readings came back completely normal, as if she were scanning empty space. But you are clearly present. You're interacting with photons to create visual impressions. You're displacing air molecules when you speak. The acoustic vibrations of your voices register on audio sensors. How can you exist physically while remaining scientifically undetectable? A fourth elf, elderly-looking with white hair and eyes like distant stars, chuckled softly. You assume that physical presence requires what you call scientific detectability. But consider this. Your own consciousness exists within your brain, yet no amount of scanning can locate your thoughts. Your feelings exist within your body, yet no instrument can measure love or wonder or curiosity directly. Those are emergent properties of complex systems. Chirp chimed defensively. They arise from specific patterns of neural activity and can be predicted mathematically. Can they? The elderly elf asked. Can you predict exactly when someone will fall in love? Can you calculate the precise moment when an artist will conceive of a new creation? Can you measure the exact quantity of hope required to attempt something that seems impossible? The three young aliens exchanged uncertain glances. These questions were pushing them into philosophical territory that their scientific training hadn't prepared them for. Marcus decided to demonstrate something he'd been wondering about. If you're really here, really helping me with my work, can you show them something concrete? Something they can measure? The copper-haired elf nodded and moved toward one of Marcus's most challenging ongoing projects, a quantum resonance chamber that had been malfunctioning for weeks. The chamber was designed to stabilize quantum fluctuations in ship engines, but it had been producing erratic harmonics that made it dangerous to use. The elf placed her hands on the chamber's control panel, though her fingers seemed to pass through the solid matter rather than pressing buttons. Instead, she appeared to be working on some deeper level, adjusting patterns and relationships that existed beneath the physical components. Immediately, the chamber's status indicators began shifting from red warning lights to amber caution signals to steady green operational readings. The erratic energy patterns that had been plaguing the system smoothed into perfect sinusoidal waves. The quantum field stabilized at optimal parameters. ZYX 441 rushed to scan the chamber with her instruments. Every reading showed dramatic improvement. Efficiency had increased by 40%, power consumption had dropped by 25%, and the harmonic distortions had completely disappeared. "That is impossible," she whispered, staring at her datapad. The quantum resonance matrix requires precise calibration of 17 interdependent variables. The calculation alone would take a team of engineers several hours, and the physical adjustments would require specialized tools and complete system shutdown. Yet it is done, the copper-haired elf said simply. We work with the fundamental patterns that underlie your technology. We adjust the relationships between components at levels your instruments cannot perceive. Skitter scuttled closer to examine the chamber with her own sensors. The improvements are real and measurable, but there is no record of any physical modifications. No tool marks, no component replacements, no circuit alterations. The changes appear to have occurred at the quantum level itself. The dark-haired elf who had been explaining consciousness stepped forward again. Your species understand quantum mechanics theoretically, but you still think in terms of classical physics when it comes to consciousness and intent. You know that observation affects quantum states, yet you do not consider that focused intention might do the same. Marcus was beginning to understand. You're saying that consciousness itself can interact with quantum systems? We are saying, the silver-haired leader replied, that consciousness is not separate from quantum systems. Your thoughts, your intentions, your will, these are quantum phenomena. Most beings are unaware of this connection and so cannot use it deliberately. But some, like your friend Marcus, develop an intuitive understanding through years of respectful practice. This is why your folklore speaks of elves and helpful spirits, added the elderly elf. Skilled craftsmen throughout your history have occasionally become aware of this deeper level of interaction. They felt our presence because their focused attention and genuine gratitude created a quantum resonance that we could respond to. Chirp's harmonic vibrations had settled into a more stable pattern, though he still sounded shaken. You are suggesting that consciousness can manipulate physical reality through quantum field interactions? Not suggesting. The copper-haired elf corrected gently, demonstrating. You have just witnessed it happening. ZYX 441 was pacing now, her logical mind struggling to process what she had seen. But this implies that all of our assumptions about the relationship between mind and matter are incomplete. If consciousness can directly affect quantum systems, then entire fields of science need to be reconsidered. Yes, the silver-haired elf agreed. Your young civilizations have made remarkable progress in understanding the mechanical aspects of the universe. But you have barely begun to explore the relationship between awareness and reality. Marcus looked around at the 5 elves, then at his 3 young alien friends who were clearly having their worldviews fundamentally challenged. So you've been helping me because I somehow made that quantum connection? You called to us without knowing you were calling, the dark-haired elf explained. Your respectful approach to your craft, your gratitude for your tools and abilities, your genuine desire to help others, these created a resonance pattern that we recognized. We have been drawn to such patterns for millennia. Across all species? Skitter asked. Across all species that develop consciousness, the elderly elf confirmed. Though each race tends to describe us differently according to their cultural frameworks. Your people called us elves and spirits. The ancient Valens spoke of the geometric guides. Early Thraxan colonies knew us as the Tunnel Whispers. The first Zephyrite explorers sang of the Harmony Helpers. ZYX 441 stopped pacing abruptly. The geometric guides are mentioned in our oldest mathematical texts. They were described as theoretical entities that helped early calculators solve complex problems. We assumed they were metaphors for intuitive understanding. Not metaphors, the silver-haired elf said. Memories. Chirp's body rang with a complex melody that the universal translator struggled to interpret. Finally, it managed. He says that ancient Zephyrite songs do speak of beings who would harmonize with explorers and help them navigate dangerous territories. But those were considered mythological compositions. Myth and memory often intertwine, the copper-haired elf observed. Your ancestors knew us, but as your civilizations became more focused on measurable phenomena, you gradually forgot how to perceive us. Except for humans, Marcus said, understanding dawning in his voice. We kept the stories alive. Your species has a unique relationship with the boundary between the measured and the unmeasured, the elderly elf explained. You never fully committed to the idea that only the quantifiable is real. Your literature, your art, your folklore, they all acknowledge mysteries that science cannot yet explain. The young elf with dark hair moved to another piece of equipment, a diagnostic scanner that had been giving inconsistent readings for days. Again, without touching the physical components, he seemed to work with the underlying patterns that governed its operation. Within moments, the scanner was functioning perfectly. This is why we revealed ourselves to you, he said to the 3 alien students. Your friend Marcus asked us to help expand your understanding. You are the next generation of scientists and engineers. If you can learn to work with these deeper levels of reality, your species will make advances that would otherwise take centuries. ZYX 441 ran her hands over her facial tattoos, a gesture Marcus had learned indicated deep thought among her people. But how would we even begin to study something that cannot be detected by our instruments? The same way your ancestors did, the silver-haired elf replied. Through direct experience, through practice and patience, through developing the kind of respectful relationship with your work that Marcus has cultivated. You mean meditation and spiritual practices? Skitter asked, her tone skeptical. We mean conscious attention, the copper-haired elf clarified. Your instruments are extensions of your consciousness. If you learn to use your awareness more skillfully, your instruments will become more sensitive to subtle phenomena. Marcus was beginning to see the bigger picture. This is why human technology sometimes seems to work better than it should on paper. We've been unconsciously tapping into these deeper levels of interaction. Some humans have, the elderly elf agreed. Those who approach their work with what you might call reverence. Those who understand that they are partnering with the universe rather than simply manipulating it. Chirp chimed a long, complex question that took the translator several seconds to process. He wants to know if this means that consciousness is fundamental to the structure of reality itself, not just an emergent property of complex matter arrangements. The 5 elves exchanged glances that seemed to communicate volumes. That, said the silver-haired leader, is precisely the right question to ask. And the answer will change everything your species think they know about the nature of existence. The workshop fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of minds expanding to accommodate new possibilities rather than the silence of shock. Marcus could almost see the 3 young aliens processing the implications of what they had witnessed and learned. Finally, ZYX 441 spoke in a voice much quieter than her usual formal tone. Our project was supposed to be about primitive mythologies and pre-scientific superstitions. And instead, Marcus said with a smile, you discovered that maybe the primitives and the scientists both had pieces of the truth. The copper-haired elf stepped toward the 3 students, her expression gentle but serious. The universe is vast beyond imagination, young ones. What you have learned today is just the beginning. There are layers of reality within layers, patterns within patterns, connections that span dimensions your current science cannot even theorize. But now you know we exist, added the dark-haired elf. And knowing that, you can begin to learn how to work with us, how to expand your capabilities beyond the limitations of purely mechanical approaches. The question, said the elderly elf, is what you will choose to do with this knowledge. The next few days aboard Nexus Station passed in a blur of whispered conversations and furtive glances. Word had begun to spread through the youth education program that something extraordinary had happened in the human mechanics workshop, though the exact details remained unclear to most. ZYX 441, Chirp, and Skitter had attempted to explain their experience to their peers and instructors, but their accounts were met with skepticism and concern. Marcus continued his regular duties, but he found himself working with a new awareness of the helpful presence that surrounded him. The elves remained visible to him now, moving through his workshop with casual familiarity. They didn't speak much during his regular work hours, but their assistance had become more obvious and deliberate. Tools materialized exactly where he needed them. Complex problems seemed to solve themselves, and his efficiency ratings continued to climb at rates that were drawing attention from station management. On the 4th day after the revelation, Marcus was deep in the engine core of a Thraxan freight hauler when he heard familiar voices approaching his workshop. ZYX 441, Chirp, and Skitter were returning, but this time they weren't alone. I still maintain that mass hallucination is the most likely explanation, came a voice Marcus recognized as belonging to Chief Science Officer Resh Valen, a senior member of the station's command staff. Humans are known for their susceptibility to collective delusion, particularly when isolated from their own kind. But the efficiency improvements are documented fact, ZYX 441 protested. The repairs Marcus completed in our presence required no additional materials, no system shutdowns, no standard protocols. The results were measurably superior to baseline expectations. Correlation is not causation, Resh Valen replied in the patronizing tone that Marcus had learned to associate with Valen authority figures. The human may simply be more competent than his initial assessments indicated. Marcus emerged from the engine core to find not only the three young aliens he'd expected, but also Chief Science Officer Resh Valen, Education Coordinator Thrax9 Click, and Master Harmonist Crystal Song of Stars. The senior staff members wore expressions ranging from skeptical concern to outright disbelief. Human Marcus, Resh Valen said formally, these young people have made some rather extraordinary claims about events that allegedly took place in your workspace. As their educational supervisors, we feel obligated to investigate. Marcus wiped his hands on his work rag and considered his response carefully. The elves had faded from visibility when the authority figures entered, but he could still feel their presence nearby. The silver-haired leader stood just behind Resh Valen, his expression amused but patient. What exactly would you like to investigate? Marcus asked. Thrax9 Click's mandibles clicked rapidly in what Marcus had learned was the Thraxan equivalent of nervous agitation. The students claimed to have witnessed beings that violate fundamental physical principles. As their instructor, I am concerned about the psychological effects of exposure to human mythological concepts. They think we're suffering from collective delusion brought on by human storytelling, Skitter explained, her own mandibles clicking with embarrassment. They believe you somehow hypnotized us or influenced us with psychological manipulation. Marcus looked at the three young aliens, then at their skeptical supervisors. And we three think, now that you've had a few days to process what happened. Chirp chimed along, complex melody that the universal translator rendered as, we know what we observed. The diagnostic readings were clear and unambiguous. Physical improvements occurred without detectable causal mechanisms. Either our understanding of reality is incomplete, or we experienced a shared psychotic episode. I have reviewed all sensor data from the time period in question, ZYX 441 added, consulting her ever-present data pad. There are no electromagnetic anomalies, no energy spikes, no gravitational fluctuations. Yet the quantum resonance chamber now operates at efficiency levels that should be theoretically impossible with its current configuration. Crystal Song of Stars chimed in harmonics that conveyed deep concern. Young Chirp, your psychological stability evaluation shows stress patterns consistent with cognitive dissonance. Your harmonic frequency has been unstable since the alleged incident. Because everything I thought I knew about reality has been proven wrong. Chirp replied, his crystalline body ringing with agitation. If consciousness can directly influence quantum systems, then every harmonic principle my people have developed is only a partial understanding of how the universe actually works. Resh Valen's facial tattoos shifted in patterns that Marcus interpreted as frustration mixed with paternal concern. Children, you are allowing primitive superstitions to override your scientific training. The human may be skilled at creating illusions or manipulating your perceptions, but actual violations of physical law do not occur. Marcus felt the temperature in the workshop drop slightly, and the familiar scent of pine and morning dew began to fill the recycled air. The senior staff members didn't seem to notice, but the three younger aliens exchanged meaningful glances. Would you like to see a demonstration? Marcus asked quietly. That would be most enlightening, Resh Valen replied with the confidence of someone certain they were about to debunk a hoax. Please show us these alleged supernatural assistants. Marcus looked directly at the space where he could see the silver-haired elf standing. They're not supernatural. They're just operating on levels of reality that our current science doesn't fully understand yet. He raised his voice slightly, addressing the elves directly. My friends, these are the educational supervisor for the young people who witnessed your presence. They're concerned that their students might be suffering from some kind of psychological disorder. Would you be willing to show yourselves again? The workshop fell silent except for the ambient humming of station systems. The senior staff members looked at Marcus with expressions of pity and concern, clearly convinced that they were witnessing the effects of isolation-induced mental breakdown. Then, the lights dimmed, the air shimmered, and the 5 elves materialized just as they had before. The reaction from a senior staff was immediate and dramatic. Resh Valen stumbled backward, his facial tattoos cycling through rapid color changes that Marcus had never seen before. Crystal Song of Stars rang out a discordant clash of harmonics that sounded like breaking glass. Thrax 9 Click's compound eyes dilated to their maximum extent, while her mandibles clicked in rapid-fire confusion. "Impossible," Resh Valen whispered, raising his scanner to take readings. Just as before, the instruments detected nothing unusual. There are no energy signatures, no matter displacement, no quantum field variations. You cannot exist. The elderly elf with white hair stepped forward, his ancient eyes twinkling with what might have been amusement. And yet here we stand. Perhaps the question is not whether we exist, but whether your understanding of existence is complete. We are experiencing mass hallucination. Crystal Song of Stars chimed desperately. Some form of shared psychotic break induced by environmental factors or psychological contamination. "Are you?" the copper-haired elf asked gently. "Your instruments detect our effects on physical systems, even though they cannot detect us directly. The improvements to Marcus's equipment are real and measurable. How do hallucinations repair quantum resonance chambers?" Thrax 9 Click scuttled closer, her multiple eyes focusing independently on different aspects of the elf's appearance. "You appear to be solid, yet my scanners read empty space. You speak, yet acoustic analysis shows sound waves originating from no detectable source. You are a contradiction in terms. Only if you insist that reality must conform to your current theoretical frameworks," the dark-haired elf replied. "But what if your frameworks are simply incomplete?" Marcus watched the interplay between the elves and the senior staff with fascination. These were supposed to be the most educated, most scientifically sophisticated individuals on the station. Yet they were struggling with the same conceptual barriers that had initially challenged the younger aliens. "Let me try a different approach," the silver-haired elf leader said, moving toward a bank of environmental control systems that had been experiencing intermittent failures. "You believe in the effects of consciousness on quantum systems, do you not? Your own quantum mechanics acknowledges that observation affects wave function collapse." "That is different," Resh Valen protested, though his voice had lost much of its earlier certainty. "Observation in quantum mechanics refers to interaction with measuring devices, not conscious awareness per se." "Does it?" the elf asked, placing his hands near the environmental controls. As before, his fingers seemed to pass through the solid matter while working on some deeper level of organization. The system status indicators began shifting from error warnings to optimal operation. Consider this. Who designed those measuring devices? Who programmed them to recognize specific patterns? Who decided what constitutes a meaningful measurement? The environmental system that had been cycling on and off erratically for weeks stabilized into smooth, efficient operation. Power consumption dropped by 30%, while output increased by 15%. "Consciousness designed your instruments," the elf continued. "Consciousness interpreted their readings. Consciousness decided what those readings mean. How can you separate consciousness from quantum measurement when consciousness is present at every stage of the process?" Crystal Song of Stars chimed in frequencies that conveyed deep confusion. "But consciousness is an emergent property of complex matter arrangements. It cannot exist independently of physical substrates." "Can it not?" the elderly elf asked. "You are beings whose primary existence is as harmonic patterns in crystalline matrices. Are sound waves emergent properties of their medium, or do they exist as patterns that can transfer between different media?" The Zephyrite's body rang with uncertainty. Sound waves are patterns of compression and rarefaction that propagate through matter. They can exist in different media with different characteristics, but they require some form of physical substrate for manifestation. Exactly, the copper-haired elf said with approval. Patterns that can transfer between substrates while maintaining their essential nature. Now consider the possibility that consciousness is a similar type of pattern, one that can exist in biological neural networks, quantum field fluctuations, or more exotic substrates that your current science has not yet discovered. Thrax9Click was making rapid calculations on a portable computing device. If consciousness exists as transferable patterns, then the theoretical implications are staggering. It would suggest that awareness could survive biological death, transfer between host systems, or even exist in distributed forms across multiple substrates simultaneously. Now you begin to understand, the dark-haired elf said with satisfaction. Your young friend Chirp was correct when he suggested that consciousness might be fundamental to reality rather than emergent from it. What you call matter might be more accurately described as consciousness organizing itself into stable patterns. Resh Valen's facial tattoos had stabilized into configurations that Marcus didn't recognize, probably because the Valen was experiencing emotional states that his species rarely encountered. You're suggesting that consciousness is the fundamental substrate of reality, and what we perceive as matter and energy are simply what? Thoughts? Dreams. Not dreams, the silver-haired leader corrected. Intentions. Focused awareness creating stable patterns in the quantum field that you experience as physical reality. Marcus felt like he was watching a masterclass in paradigm shifting. The elves weren't just demonstrating their existence. They were systematically dismantling every assumption about the nature of reality that the senior staff had built their careers upon. But if this is true, ZYX441 said, her voice barely above a whisper, then every technological advance, every scientific discovery, every engineering breakthrough has been accomplished through unconscious manipulation of reality, through focused intention. Some unconscious, the elderly elf agreed. But the most significant advances in any species development occur when individuals learn to work consciously with these deeper levels of reality. This is why humans have such a reputation for achieving the impossible. Chirp chimed with sudden understanding. Your species never fully accepted the separation between consciousness and physics. You maintained mythologies that kept you aware of the deeper connections. And now, the copper-haired elf said, looking directly at the three young aliens and their stunned supervisors, you have the opportunity to combine human intuitive understanding with your species' analytical capabilities. Imagine what you could accomplish with that synthesis. The workshop fell into contemplative silence as the implications began to sink in. Marcus could see the wheels turning in the minds of all six aliens as they struggled to integrate this new information with everything they thought they knew about science, technology, and the nature of existence itself. There is much you still need to learn, the silver-haired elf said eventually, and much we can teach you if you are willing to set aside your preconceptions about what is possible. Where do we begin? Resh Valen asked, his formal tone replaced by genuine curiosity for the first time since Marcus had known him. The elves smiled in unison, and the expression carried warmth that seemed to fill the entire station. With wonder, they replied together. Always with wonder. 6 months later, Marcus Chun stood in what had once been a simple maintenance workshop, but had transformed into something unprecedented in the galaxy. The first multidimensional consciousness research laboratory. The space buzzed with activity as beings from 17 different species worked alongside elves, humans, and other consciousness entities that had begun revealing themselves as word of the breakthrough spread throughout local space. The changes hadn't happened overnight, and they certainly hadn't been without controversy. When news of the elves' existence reached the core worlds, the response had been explosive. Some species had dismissed the reports as elaborate hoaxes or mass hysteria. Others had sent investigative teams to debunk what they assumed were fraudulent claims. A few forward-thinking governments had quietly begun funding research into consciousness-based technologies. But the results spoke for themselves. Ships serviced at Nexus Station now achieved efficiency ratings 30 to 40% above baseline. New technologies were being developed that shouldn't have been possible according to conventional physics. And, perhaps most importantly, the rigid boundaries between different scientific disciplines were beginning to dissolve as researchers learned to work with the deeper patterns that connected all aspects of reality. Marcus watched as ZYX 441 collaborated with an elf named Starweaver to calibrate a new type of quantum navigation system. The Valen's approach to mathematics had evolved dramatically over the past months. Where once she had relied purely on computational analysis, she now incorporated intuitive pattern recognition that allowed her to see relationships that no amount of calculation could reveal. "The geometric harmonies are stabilizing," she announced, her facial tattoos glowing with excitement. "Power efficiency is holding steady at 112% of theoretical maximum." Theoretical maximum according to the old models, Starweaver reminded her with a gentle smile. When you include consciousness as an active factor in the equations, these efficiency levels become not just possible, but inevitable. Nearby, Chirp was working with the elderly elf to develop new harmonic techniques that could resonate with quantum fields directly. The Zephyrite's crystalline body had developed new acoustic capabilities since learning to work with consciousness-based manipulation. His songs could now tune matter at the subatomic level, creating materials with properties that defied conventional understanding. Skitter and several other young Thraxans had formed a partnership with a group of elves who specialized in what they called tunneling consciousness, the ability to perceive and navigate through higher dimensional spaces. The implications for interstellar travel were staggering. Instead of fighting against the limitations of three-dimensional space, ships could slide through dimensional folds that consciousness could perceive, but instruments could not detect. Even the senior staff had adapted to the new paradigm, though not without considerable psychological adjustment. Resh Valen had undergone what could only be described as a complete scientific awakening. His research into consciousness-based physics was producing theoretical frameworks that unified quantum mechanics, relativity, and consciousness into coherent mathematical models. "Marcus," came a familiar voice behind him. He turned to find Captain Stellar Winddancing, the Zephyrite commander of Nexus Station, approaching with her characteristic harmonic greeting. "The Galactic Science Consortium has sent another delegation. They're requesting a formal demonstration." Marcus sighed. This was the fourth such delegation in 2 months. Each time, representatives from various governments and scientific institutions arrived, convinced they could debunk or discredit what was happening at the station. Each time, they left with their worldviews fundamentally altered. "How many this time?" Marcus asked. 12 representatives from 9 different species, Captain Stellar Winddancing replied, including Professor Nick's quantum theory from the Valence Science Academy and High Calculator Maze Walker Supreme from the Thraxan Technical Institute. "The heavy hitters," Marcus observed. "These are some of the most respected scientists in known space, beings whose theories formed the foundation of modern galactic technology. They have brought extensive sensor equipment and claim they will expose what they term the consciousness hoax once and for all," the captain continued. "They seem particularly confident that they can demonstrate the impossibility of non-material beings affecting physical systems." The silver-haired elf leader, who had introduced himself as Moon Whisper, materialized beside them with his characteristic shimmer of displaced light. "Ah, the final skeptics arrive. We have been expecting them. Are you concerned?" Marcus asked. "These aren't naive students or junior researchers. These are the beings who wrote the textbooks that define what's considered scientifically possible." Moon Whisper smiled with ancient patience, which is precisely why it is important that they witness what we do here. When the foundations of scientific orthodoxy accept new paradigms, change becomes inevitable rather than merely possible. An hour later, Marcus found himself facing the most intimidating gathering of scientific minds he had ever encountered. The 12 delegates had arranged themselves in a semicircle around his workshop, their various scanning devices aimed at every conceivable angle. Professor Nick's quantum theory stood at the center of the group, her blue skin marked with the most complex geometric tattoos Marcus had ever seen, equations and proofs etched directly into her flesh as symbols of her mathematical mastery. "Human Marcus," she said in the formal tone that Valens used for official proceedings, "we have come to investigate claims that beings exist who can violate fundamental physical principles. We represent the most advanced scientific institutions in known space, and we are here to determine whether these claims have any basis in measurable reality." High Calculator Maze Walker Supreme stepped forward, her massive Thraxan frame clicking with the precision of a living computer. "Our preliminary analysis suggests that all reported phenomena can be explained through conventional means: confirmation bias, statistical manipulation, instrumental error, or deliberate fraud. We are prepared to document the exact mechanisms being used to create these illusions." Marcus looked around the workshop at the elves who stood patiently waiting, invisible to the scanning equipment, but clearly present to anyone who had learned to perceive them properly. Then he looked at his alien colleagues, Ix-441, Chirp, Skitter, and the senior staff who had become partners in this revolutionary research. "Before we begin," Marcus said carefully, "I want to make sure everyone understands what we're dealing with here. We're not claiming that the laws of physics are being violated. We're suggesting that those laws are more complex and more inclusive than current theory acknowledges." A crystalline being that Marcus didn't recognize chimed in frequencies that the translator rendered as skeptical dismissal. "Consciousness cannot affect quantum systems independently of physical measurement devices. This has been established through centuries of rigorous experimentation." "Has it?" asked Moonwhisper, though he remained invisible to the delegates. "Or have your experiments been designed specifically to exclude consciousness as a variable, thus ensuring that you would never detect its effects?" Marcus repeated the elf's words aloud, and the response was immediate. "Consciousness is not a measurable variable," Professor Nick's quantum theory declared. "It cannot be quantified, controlled, or isolated in experimental conditions." "With respect," Marcus replied, "that's exactly the kind of assumption we're challenging here. You're saying consciousness can't be studied scientifically because it doesn't fit the parameters of current scientific methodology. But what if the methodology needs to expand?" High Calculator Maze Walker Supreme clicked her mandibles in what Marcus recognized as Thraxan impatience. "Methodology exists to eliminate subjective variables and ensure reproducible results. If consciousness could affect physical systems, the implications would make all scientific knowledge unreliable. Or it would make scientific knowledge more complete," suggested ZYX-441, stepping forward with confidence that surprised Marcus. 6 months ago, she would never have contradicted such distinguished authority figures. What if consciousness is not a subjective variable to be eliminated, but an objective factor that we've been unconsciously excluding from our models? The elderly elf moved toward one of the quantum navigation systems that ZYX-441 and Starweaver had been calibrating. As always, his approach was to work with the underlying patterns rather than the surface mechanisms. "Watch your instruments," Marcus instructed the delegates. "But don't just watch for the things you expect to see. Watch for changes in system behavior that shouldn't be possible according to current theory." The elderly elf began working with the navigation system, his hands moving in complex patterns that seemed to guide quantum fields through adjustments that should have required massive computational power and precise mechanical manipulation. The system's efficiency climbed steadily, 115%, 120%, 130% of theoretical maximum. The delegates' scanners showed dramatic improvements in system performance, but no detectable causal mechanisms. Power consumption dropped while output increased. Harmonic distortions that had been present in the quantum fields disappeared. Navigation accuracy improved by orders of magnitude. "Impossible," whispered a small, insect-like being that Marcus didn't recognize. "Quantum navigation systems have absolute efficiency limits based on uncertainty principle constraints. These readings violate fundamental thermodynamic laws. Do they? Chirp chimed from where he was working with his elf partner on harmonic field manipulation. Or do they demonstrate that those laws were formulated with incomplete information about the variables involved? To demonstrate, Chirp began singing one of the new harmonic patterns he had learned. His crystalline body resonated with frequencies that seemed to reach directly into the quantum substrate of matter. A piece of standard hull plating began to restructure itself at the molecular level, becoming lighter, stronger, and more flexible than should have been possible with its original composition. More scanners registered impossible readings. Matter was being reorganized without heat, without external energy input, without detectable force application. The hull plating had become a material that shouldn't exist according to established material science. Professor Nick's quantum theory stared at her instruments in disbelief. The molecular bonds have been completely reorganized, but there is no record of the energy required for such restructuring. Mass energy conservation appears to have been violated. Not violated, Moon Whisper explained, though Marcus had to repeat his words. Consciousness provides the organizational energy through quantum field manipulation. The energy doesn't come from outside the system. It comes from consciousness learning to work more efficiently with the patterns that already exist. The demonstration continued for 3 hours. The elves worked with various station systems, always improving efficiency and capability beyond theoretical limits, always leaving the sophisticated scanning equipment of the delegates unable to detect the mechanisms involved. Skitter and her tunneling consciousness partners demonstrated dimensional navigation by temporarily opening a fold in space that allowed a probe to travel 17 light-years in less than a minute. The probe's readings confirmed its location in the Centauri system before it returned through the same dimensional fold. High Calculator Maze Walker Supreme ran extensive analysis on the probe's telemetry. The data indicates genuine faster-than-light travel, but through mechanisms that do not register on our instruments. According to our calculations, the energy required for such dimensional manipulation would require the output of an entire star. Unless, suggested the copper-haired elf through Marcus's translation, consciousness can access energy sources that exist outside three-dimensional space. What you call dimensional manipulation, we call conscious navigation through spaces that awareness can perceive directly. By the end of the demonstration, the 12 delegates stood in stunned silence, their instruments having recorded phenomena that challenged every assumption they had made about the nature of reality. The evidence was undeniable. Consciousness could affect physical systems in ways that current science could not explain or even detect directly. Professor Nick's quantum theory was the first to speak. If these observations are accurate, she said slowly, then we must completely reconceptualize our understanding of the relationship between mind and matter. The implications extend beyond engineering and technology into fundamental questions about the nature of existence itself. Yes, Moon Whisper agreed through Marcus, which is why this is not simply a technological revolution, but a consciousness evolution. Your species are ready to take the next step in your development, learning to work consciously with the deeper patterns that govern reality. A small, elderly delegate that Marcus hadn't heard speak before raised a trembling appendage. But if consciousness is fundamental to physics, then our entire civilization, our technology, our understanding of ourselves and the universe, everything changes. Everything evolves, the silver-haired elf corrected gently. You do not lose what you have learned. You expand it. Your mathematics become more powerful when they include consciousness variables. Your engineering becomes more elegant when it works with awareness as well as energy. Your exploration of space becomes exploration of dimensions that consciousness can navigate. High Calculator Maze Walker Supreme clicked her mandibles in what Marcus had learned to recognize as deep thought processing. The practical applications are staggering. If consciousness can manipulate quantum fields directly, then we could develop technologies that are limited only by the scope of awareness rather than the availability of energy or materials. But more than that, Zix 441 added, we could begin to understand ourselves and our place in the universe in completely new ways. If consciousness is fundamental to reality, then every thinking being is a participant in the ongoing creation of existence itself. The elderly elf smiled with profound approval. Now you begin to understand what we have been trying to teach you. You're not separate from the universe, observing it from outside. You are expressions of universal consciousness exploring itself through countless perspectives. The workshop fell silent as the implications settled into the minds of the gathered scientists. Marcus could see the moment when their resistance to new paradigms finally collapsed, replaced by wonder at the vastness of what they had yet to discover. Professor Nick's quantum theory spoke for all of them. We will need to completely restructure our educational systems, our research methodologies, our technological development programs. This is not just a scientific revolution. This is a transformation in what it means to be a conscious being in an unconscious universe. Yes, Moon Whisper agreed. And it is a transformation that has been waiting to happen for millennia. Your species have finally reached the point where you can consciously participate in the evolution of consciousness itself. Marcus looked around the workshop at the gathering of beings who represented the most advanced scientific minds in known space, all of them now committed to exploring realities that they had dismissed as impossible just hours before. So what happens now? He asked. Moon Whisper smiled with the patience of ages. Now the real work begins, teaching consciousness to know itself as the creative force behind all existence. It is the most important work any being can undertake. And in workshops and laboratories throughout the galaxy, the next phase of cosmic evolution began to unfold, guided by the ancient wisdom of elves and the irrepressible curiosity of species ready to discover that the universe was far more magical than they had ever dared to dream. The age of consciousness-based technology had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again.